Vienna, winter, beneath the Capuchin church, in a vault that has no windows and no natural light. A procession stops in front of an iron door. The men carrying the coffin are dressed in black. The candles throw long shadows up the stone walls. Outside, the city is going about its business. Down here, something older is happening. A court official steps forward and knocks 3 times. From behind the door, a voice, a Capuchin friar, speaking in German, who requests entry. The official begins to read. The titles come out one after another, each one earned or inherited or fought over across centuries. Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, King of Hungary and Bohemia, Archduke of Austria, Duke of Burgundy and Brabant, Count of Habsburg and Tyrol. The list goes on. These are the accumulated claims of a family that spent 600 years reaching for more, and the titles reflect every inch of ground they ever touched. The door does not open. The friar speaks again from the other side. We do not know that person. The official tries again. A shorter version this time. The most important titles. Still a long list by any ordinary standard. Silence. Then, we do not know that person. One more time. The official sets aside everything. Every title. Every kingdom. Every claim. And he says only this, a poor sinner, who begs for the mercy of God. The iron door opens. This ceremony is real. The Habsburg family practiced it for centuries. Every time one of their own was brought to this vault for burial, more than 100 of them rest in here, in bronze coffins, decorated with the symbols of everything they ruled. But none of that gets you through the door. Only the last thing gets you through. Only the admission that underneath all of it, you were a person, the same as anyone else. That is a strange thing for a family to build into their own funeral rites. A family that at its peak controlled more of Europe than anyone before them. A family that collected kingdoms the way other families collected debts. Why would they choose to end like this? The answer requires going back to the beginning. To a small castle on a hill that no one alive today has ever heard of, to a moment when nobody was afraid of the Habsburgs yet, when they were still just a family with an idea, and the patience to wait for the right moment to use it. Frankfurt, September 1273. The 7 men sitting in that room had the power to choose an emperor, and they were in no hurry to choose a strong one. The Holy Roman Empire had been without an emperor for nearly 20 years. That gap had been exactly as chaotic as it sounds. Local lords filled the vacuum with private wars and private deals. The roads were dangerous. Justice was whatever the nearest armed man decided it was. The 7 electors who gathered in Frankfurt that September could have picked someone capable and decisive, someone who might actually restore order to the mess the empire had become. They picked Rudolf of Habsburg instead. Rudolf was 55 years old, a count from a mountainous region in what is now Switzerland. His family name came from their castle, Habsburg, which translates roughly as Hawk Castle, and which was, by all accounts, a perfectly ordinary stone building on a perfectly ordinary hill. He had fought in enough minor conflicts to prove he was not incompetent. He was not, by any measure, the most powerful man in the room. That was the point. The electors were not looking for someone to lead them. They wanted someone to wear the title without threatening their own positions. A strong emperor might try to centralize power, collect taxes, and tell lords what to do with their own lands. Rudolf of Habsburg looked like a man they could manage. Rudolf understood this completely. He accepted the honor with the kind of humility that men who are very good at long games tend to perform when the first move goes their way. What the electors did not understand was that the position itself had value even when the man holding it appeared weak. The title of Holy Roman Emperor was an argument. It said, I have a claim to authority that goes back to Charlemagne, that carries the blessing of the church, that places me above other kings in the order of things. You could not dismiss that argument with a sword. You had to reckon with it. Rudolf's first real test came from Ottokar II, King of Bohemia, the most powerful ruler in the German lands, who saw no reason to recognize this new emperor from a family he considered beneath him. Ottokar refused to pay the formal respects that Rudolf's position required. He was, in almost every practical sense, more powerful than the man he was refusing to acknowledge. Rudolf did not march on him immediately. He waited. He worked the politics of the German nobility, collecting acknowledgments of his legitimacy, the way a man collects debts he intends to call in later. He isolated Ottokar slowly and carefully, until the Bohemian king found himself standing alone against a coalition that Rudolf had assembled not through force, but through patience. When Rudolf finally moved against Ottokar militarily, in 1278 on the Marchfeld plain, he won. Ottokar died on the field. The territory that passed out of Bohemian control in the aftermath included a region called Austria, a collection of lands along the Danube that would become the foundation everything else was built on. Rudolf died in 1291. He left behind no empire in any grand sense, just Austria, a reputation for competence, and a set of habits he had modeled for his children. Do not fight when you can wait. Do not spend when you can negotiate. Do not let people see what you want until you already have it. He had also left behind something he could not have named, but that his descendants would prove to be the most powerful thing a dynasty can possess, the understanding that legitimacy compounds over time. Every generation that held the position made it slightly more natural that the next generation would hold it too. The Habsburgs were learning, slowly and deliberately, how to become somebody that no one could imagine being without. The next lesson would not come from a battlefield. It would come from a wedding. It always came from a wedding. Ghent, August, 1477. Mary of Burgundy was 20 years old, and she had been Duchess for 4 months, and every powerful man in Europe was circling her. Her father, Charles the Bold, had died in January on a frozen battlefield near Nancy. He left behind no sons. He left behind Mary, one of the wealthiest unmarried women in the history of Western Europe, and a territory that every neighboring ruler immediately began calculating how to absorb. Burgundy was not simply a piece of land. It was a network of the richest cities in the world. Ghent, Bruges, Antwerp, the cloth, the trade, the money. Whoever controlled Burgundy controlled the economic engine of Northern Europe. Louis XI of France was the most immediate threat. French armies were already moving toward Burgundian territory. Louis sent diplomats with a proposal. Mary should marry the French Dauphin, a child of 7. The marriage would bring Burgundy into the French crown. Louis presented this as a generous offer. It was the end of Burgundy, dressed up as a wedding invitation. Mary read the situation with a clarity that surprised people who expected a young woman in her position to be paralyzed. She understood what the French proposal actually meant, and she understood that her only real protection was marriage to someone powerful enough to make Louis reconsider. The candidate she settled on was Maximilian of Habsburg, the 19-year-old son of the Holy Roman Emperor. He had no army in Burgundy. He had limited personal wealth. He was from Austria, which was not a place that Burgundian merchants thought about much. What he had was a title and the theoretical backing of the empire his father represented, against a French king with real armies on the border. That looked like very little, but Mary was thinking about the next 10 years, not the next 6 months. A French marriage meant absorption. A Habsburg marriage meant alliance. A partner who brought imperial legitimacy, but who could not simply swallow Burgundy whole. Maximilian would be her husband, but Burgundy would remain Burgundy. Her children would inherit both. They married in August. By most accounts, it was a genuine partnership, which was not something anyone had necessarily expected. Maximilian was energetic and imaginative, a young man who threw himself into Burgundian culture with an enthusiasm the nobility found surprising and then disarming. Mary was precise and capable, someone who had been watching her father run one of the most complex administrative territories in Europe since she was old enough to sit in a meeting. What Maximilian saw in the Burgundian marriage, beyond the immediate value of the territory, was a proof of concept. One marriage had done what a decade of warfare could not have achieved. Burgundy had not been conquered. It had been joined. The people of Burgundy had not been defeated. They had acquired a new connection to the imperial house of Europe without losing their own identity. Nobody hated the Habsburgs for this, because there was nothing to hate them for. No burned villages, no soldiers, no humiliation of a proud people forced to acknowledge a conqueror. There was just a wedding, and then a new reality, and then children who embodied both. Maximilian began to see the shape of something larger. If one marriage could do this, what could a deliberate, multi-generational policy of strategic marriage accomplish? He had daughters and a son and a set of European dynasties that all needed heirs and alliances. The pieces were there. It required only the patience to move them correctly. The phrase that would eventually be attached to his dynasty captured the idea in Latin. Others wage war. You, happy Austria, marry. The exact origin of that line is debated by historians. What is not debated is that it described a strategy being executed with conscious precision across multiple generations. Mary of Burgundy died in 1482. She was 25. A riding accident. Injuries that the medicine of the time could not address. Maximilian held the Burgundian inheritance together for their son Philip through years of difficult fighting against French pressure. He managed it. The system survived the loss of the woman who had made it possible. Philip would carry the Burgundian inheritance into the next generation. And Philip was about to marry a Spanish princess whose mother had just unified a kingdom and whose family had a connection to a sailor named Columbus, who had recently found something across the Atlantic that nobody quite had words for yet. The system was about to get very large very fast. Tordesillas, Spain. The year 1509. A woman sits in a room with the curtains drawn. She has not allowed anyone to change her clothes in longer than the servants will say when asked. She will not let them open the windows. She does not receive visitors. Outside the walls of the castle of Tordesillas, in the rolling flatlands of Castile, Spain is the most powerful kingdom in the world, the center of an empire that now extends to continents that European mapmakers are still trying to figure out how to draw. That empire belongs to the woman in the darkened room. She is the legitimate queen of Castile. She will stay in that room for 46 more years. Her name is Joanna. History will call her Juana la Loca, Joanna the Mad. That name made it easy to move past her quickly on the way to the more comfortable story of Habsburg greatness. But the question of whether Joanna was actually mad, or whether she was a woman with real power surrounded by men who needed her to be mad in order to hold on to that power themselves, is one of the most haunting questions in the entire history of this family. Her suffering was real. The political usefulness of her confinement to the men who arranged it was also real. Whether what happened to her was illness or grief or manipulation, or all three woven together, is something the historical record does not resolve cleanly. And anyone who tells you otherwise is simplifying in a direction that suits them. Start before Tordesillas. Start with who she was before the room. Joanna was the third child of Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile, the two monarchs who had unified Spain and funded Columbus and built the most formidable royal partnership in Europe. She was educated carefully in languages and theology and the responsibilities of royal life. She was, by multiple accounts, intelligent and perceptive, someone who noticed things and remembered them. In 1496 she was sent to Flanders to marry Philip of Habsburg, the son of Maximilian and Mary of Burgundy. Philip was 20 years old and strikingly handsome, which is how he got the nickname that history gave him, Philip the Handsome. He was also charming in the way that people who are used to getting everything they want can be charming. Lightly and without particular depth. What happened between Joanna and Philip is described in the sources with a consistency that crosses the usual boundaries of court propaganda. She fell for him completely, and he did not fall for her in the same way. His infidelities were not occasional or discreet. They were frequent and visible, and they destroyed something in Joanna that never properly healed. Whether what she experienced was a condition that the infidelities aggravated, or whether it was the entirely comprehensible response of an intelligent woman trapped in a marriage to a man who humiliated her repeatedly and publicly. The people around her found it increasingly convenient to call madness. Philip died suddenly in 1506. He was 28. Joanna was 27, pregnant with her 6th child, and the Queen of Castile, because her mother, Isabella, had died 2 years earlier, and the crown had passed to her. The stories that collected around the months after Philip's death became the foundation of the Joanna the Mad legend. She reportedly refused to allow his body to be buried. She travelled with the coffin through the Castilian winter, stopping at monasteries, insisting the coffin be opened so she could see him. Later writers embellished this into something grotesque, a widow who could not let go. But what the sources also establish is this: Joanna's father Ferdinand moved quickly to reassert control over Castile after Philip's death, using his daughter's fragile state as justification. She was moved to Tordesillas in 1509. She was kept there, with limited access to her children, for the rest of her life. Her son was Charles. He would inherit Castile from her, Aragon from his grandfather Ferdinand, Burgundy and Austria from his grandfather Maximilian. He would become the most powerful man in Europe and then in the world. He visited his mother twice in 40 years. He never released her. Joanna died in 1555, 76 years old, in the room at Tordesillas. She had been Queen of Castile for 49 years and had been permitted to exercise no power as queen for 46 of them. The wealth of the Americas, the gold and silver that was already beginning to transform the European economy, flowed through her name and over her head and into the hands of men who had decided she could not be trusted to manage it. The Habsburg marriage system had brought Spain into the family. Joanna was the mechanism through which that happened. The system worked. The empire expanded. And the woman at the center of it sat in a dark room for 46 years while the world she had inherited was run by other people. This was what the first price of blood looked like. It would not be the last time the system asked someone to pay it. Aachen, October 1520. The coronation ceremony had been going on for hours. Charles Habsburg stood in the cathedral while priests moved around him in the slow choreography that the church had been rehearsing for centuries. The crown of Charlemagne was placed on his head. The orb and scepter were put in his hands. The words were spoken in Latin, the language that connected this moment to every moment, like it going back 700 years. Back to the night in Rome when the Pope crowned a Frankish king and invented the idea that someone was responsible for holding the Christian world together. The people watching Charles expected to see triumph. What they saw instead, by the accounts of those paying attention, was a young man absorbing weight. He was 20 years old, and what he had inherited by the time that crown touched his head was so large that listing it feels almost absurd. From his mother Joanna, the kingdom of Castile and everything it controlled, which included a new world across the Atlantic that was still being mapped and whose full dimensions no one yet understood. From his grandfather Ferdinand, the kingdom of Aragon, the Spanish Mediterranean, the kingdom of Naples. From his grandfather Maximilian, Austria, the Tyrol, the Habsburg lands across the German-speaking world, and from the Electoral College of the Holy Roman Empire, which voted in 1519 the title of Holy Roman Emperor, won through years of dynastic positioning and political machinery that Maximilian had spent his life constructing. No single person had ever held this much at once. Charles spoke French with the Burgundian court because that was the language he had grown up with in the Netherlands. He spoke Spanish with his Castilian advisors. He spoke German with the German princes. Badly at first, and better later, because German was not his first language, despite his being the German emperor. He spoke Latin in formal correspondence. A story has come down through the years, probably shaped in the retelling but emotionally true, that he once said he spoke to God in Spanish, to women in Italian, to men in French, and to horses in German. The point of the story is not the languages. The point is that there was no language he could call home. He was the ruler of everywhere and the native of nowhere. He was also, from the first days of his reign, constantly in motion. A letter from Mexico took 3 months to reach Madrid. A rebellion in the Netherlands could not be suppressed from Spain before it had time to establish itself. A threat on the eastern border required a response before word of the threat had fully reached the western courts. Charles spent his reign moving from territory to territory, trying to be physically present in enough places to keep the whole structure from coming apart through neglect. He crossed the Alps 9 times. He crossed the Mediterranean between Spain and Italy repeatedly. He slept in hundreds of different beds and sat at hundreds of different council tables. A map of his movements in any single year looks like the path of a man who cannot stop, not because he does not want to, but because stopping means something falls apart somewhere. The gout found him early. It was a Habsburg inheritance, passed through the bloodline like a tax nobody had agreed to pay. His joints ached. In later years, the pain was severe enough to affect his ability to ride and write. He kept moving anyway. There is a portrait of Charles painted around 1530 by Titian, the greatest portraitist of the age, which captures something the formal coronation portraits deliberately avoided. He is seated. His face is intelligent and tired in equal measure. The famous Habsburg jaw is there, the lower jaw pushing slightly forward, the family inheritance written into the bone structure of the most powerful face in the world. He looks like a man who has been doing an enormous amount of thinking for a very long time and has not yet arrived at a satisfying conclusion. What that portrait does not show is what would happen the following year. Because in 1521, into the middle of all this accumulated complexity, came a problem that could not be solved by marriage, or money, or military force, or any of the instruments the Habsburgs had spent 2 centuries developing. A German monk had been saying things that Charles could not allow to go unanswered and could not figure out how to stop. The monk's name was Martin Luther, and Charles was about to meet him in a room in the city of Worms. The conversation that happened between them would send a crack through the Christian world that nothing, not then and not ever, would fully close. Worms, April 18th, 1521. The room was smaller than the occasion deserved. Martin Luther stood in front of a table covered with books and papers. Everything he had written and published in the 4 years since he had first begun publicly challenging the practices of the Roman Church. The books were his. The papers were his. They had been placed there to give him a clear choice: pick them up and take them back. Renounce what was in them, or leave them on the table and accept the consequences. Charles sat across from him, 21 years old, with the controlled expression of a man who had been trained since childhood to reveal nothing in public that he had not decided in advance to reveal. Around them were electors and princes and church officials and diplomats. The full weight of the Holy Roman Empire gathered in one room to watch a monk decide whether he was willing to back down. Luther was 37. He had grown up the son of a copper miner in Saxony, had become an Augustinian friar and a professor of theology, and had spent years wrestling with questions about sin and salvation and the gap between what the church taught and what he could find in the scripture he read. What he had come to believe was that the church had built an elaborate structure of practices and authorities between the individual believer and God, and that this structure could not, in his reading of scripture, be justified by what the Bible actually said. The church saw his challenge as a threat to apostolic tradition and to the institutional unity of Christendom that had held the Western world together since the fall of Rome. Charles saw it the same way, but from a political angle that Luther may not have fully appreciated. The Holy Roman Empire drew its legitimacy from the idea that it was the secular arm of a unified Christian civilization. A pope in Rome blessed the emperor in Aachen. The emperor protected the church with his armies. If the church shattered into competing versions of Christianity, the empire shattered with it. Charles was not defending the pope out of blind faith alone. He was defending the foundation his empire stood on. In the room in Worms, Luther was asked directly whether he would recant. His answer, in the version that has come down through the centuries, with some variation in the exact words, but not in the substance. He could not recant unless he was shown from scripture or plain reason that he was wrong. To act against conscience was neither safe nor right. The famous, shorter version, "Here I stand. I cannot do otherwise," may not be verbatim, but the substance of the refusal was clear and recorded by multiple witnesses in that room. Charles could have arrested Luther on the spot. The legal case was straightforward. Luther had been declared a heretic by the church. The emperor was the secular arm of the church. But Charles had made a promise. Before Luther came to Worms, he had issued a guarantee of safe conduct, a formal imperial commitment that Luther could travel to the hearing and return home without being seized. It was a promise made in the name of the emperor, and Charles was a man for whom the honor of that office mattered more than the convenience of breaking it. Luther left Worms a free man. He disappeared shortly afterward into a castle called the Wartburg, where a sympathetic German prince was hiding him. and where he spent 10 months translating the New Testament into German, a version so readable and so widely distributed that it shaped the German language itself for centuries. Charles wrote to his advisers the night after the hearing. "A monk," he said, "cannot be right when 1,000 years of Christianity is wrong." It was not the statement of a man without intelligence. It was the statement of a man who had built his entire understanding of his own role on a foundation he could not afford to imagine might be cracked. What happened next did not happen all at once. The Reformation moved through Europe the way a fire moves through dry ground, following paths of least resistance, finding places where people were already angry, or already curious, or already looking for a reason to stop paying money to Rome. A printer in Nuremberg reading Luther's German New Testament for the first time. A city council in Zurich deciding that scripture was a higher authority than papal tradition. A German prince seeing an opportunity to take church lands in his territory and finding theological cover for doing it. 3 different people with 3 different reasons, all moving in the same direction. Charles spent the next 30 years trying to hold the Christian world together against a fracture that a single afternoon in Worms had made irreversible. He fought wars and called councils and negotiated compromises and watched the map of European religion transform into something his grandfather, Maximilian, would not have recognized. In 1555, he finally accepted what the evidence had been telling him for decades. The Peace of Augsburg established the principle that each German prince could determine the religion of his own territory. The unified Christian world that Charles had understood as both his inheritance and his responsibility was officially, legally, permanently divided. Then he did something that no one in his position had ever done. He decided to put the weight down. Brussels, October 25th, 1556. He stood in front of his court in the great hall of the palace, leaning on the shoulder of a young William of Orange, because his gout had made standing alone painful. And he gave a speech that the people in the room remembered for the rest of their lives. He spoke about what he had tried to do, and what he had failed to do, and what he was leaving behind. He asked forgiveness for his errors. Men who had spent careers learning not to show emotion in public wept openly. Then he took off the crown and handed it to his son. He retired to a monastery in western Spain called Yuste, where he spent his final 2 years in a set of simple rooms, attending Mass, tending a small garden, and doing something he had found genuinely satisfying for years, repairing clocks. He liked the way the small parts fit together. He liked that when you fixed something in a clock, it stayed fixed. He liked the honesty of a mechanism that either worked or did not work, with no room for the ambiguity that had defined every political problem he had ever tried to solve. He died in 1558. The empire he left behind had been divided between his brother Ferdinand, who took Austria and the imperial title, and his son Philip, who took Spain and the Netherlands and the Americas. One family, 2 courts, 2 futures that would diverge in ways the man who divided them could not have predicted. In the mountains outside Madrid, Philip was already building something that would tell you everything you needed to know about the kind of ruler he intended to be. El Escorial, 1584, 45 kilometers northwest of Madrid. In the foothills of the Sierra de Guadarrama, a building had just been completed that told you everything you needed to know about the man who ordered it built. No curves, no playfulness in the stonework. El Escorial was constructed in grey granite, in straight lines, in a geometry so severe and so deliberate that standing in front of it felt less like looking at a building and more like being evaluated by one. It was a palace and a monastery and a royal tomb combined into a single structure. And the combination was not accidental. Philip II wanted to live where his ancestors were buried and where monks prayed without stopping, because he understood his reign as an act of continuous religious obligation, and he wanted the architecture of his daily life to reflect that. His working office was smaller than most people expected. A room with a desk and stacks of paper and a single window positioned so that Philip could look directly into the monastery chapel without leaving his chair. He could watch the Mass being celebrated while continuing to work. Everything about El Escorial was a choice, and every choice pointed in the same direction toward a man who experienced governing as something between a religious duty and a personal penance. Philip governed through paper in a way that no European ruler before him had attempted at this scale. Every decision of consequence came to his desk. Every appointment, every military order, every diplomatic communication moved through that office, was read by those eyes, was annotated in that handwriting. He read everything. He wrote responses in the margins of documents with the thoroughness of a scholar checking student work. The consequence of this system was that the empire moved at the speed of Philip's attention, which was considerable, and at the speed of the physical delivery of paper across enormous distances, which was not. A report from the Philippines took the better part of a year to reach El Escorial. A decision about that report took whatever time Philip needed to read and consider it. The response then took the better part of a year to travel back. Governors and commanders in distant territories learned to act first and seek approval later, because waiting for Madrid was not compatible with managing a rapidly developing situation. His joints began to fail him in his later years. He was carried to council meetings on a litter because walking the corridors of his own palace had become too painful. He sat in that chair and read those papers and wrote those marginal notes until the physical act of writing became difficult. And then he dictated. And the paper kept moving. The Netherlands was the wound that would not close. Philip had inherited the Dutch and Flemish territories from his father, and he had made a decision early in his reign that would cost Spain more than any military defeat in its history. The northern Netherlands had been moving toward Calvinist Protestantism for years, and Philip had responded by appointing the Duke of Alba as his governor there, with instructions to suppress the heresy and restore religious conformity. Alba's methods were efficient in the way that methods which do not worry about consequences tend to be efficient. He executed thousands. He levied new taxes that the merchant cities found intolerable. He created a resistance movement where there had previously been discontent. The revolt that followed lasted 80 years. It outlasted Philip. It outlasted his son and his grandson. It consumed a river of American silver that might have stabilized the Spanish economy and instead disappeared into a war that Spain could not win and could not admit it, could not win. The Armada was the same logic applied to England. Philip sent that fleet north in 1588 for reasons that were both religious and political. Elizabeth I of England had supported the Dutch rebels with money and troops. Her privateers had raided Spanish shipping and colonial ports across the Americas. And England under Elizabeth represented a Protestant power that was actively working against Catholic interests across Europe. In Philip's thinking, those two things, the religious mission and the geopolitical necessity, were not separate. They pointed in the same direction. They required the same response. 130 ships, more than 20,000 soldiers and sailors. The plan was to sail up the English Channel, link up with a Spanish army waiting in the Netherlands, transport that army across to England, and resolve the problem decisively. The English fleet met the Armada in the Channel. The English ships were smaller and faster, and their captains had spent careers learning to fight in those specific waters. The formation the Armada needed to execute the rendezvous broke apart after the English sent fireships into the anchored fleet at midnight off the Flemish coast. The Spanish scattered into open water. The army in the Netherlands never got on the boats. The Armada turned north, trying to get home by sailing around Scotland and Ireland. The weather on the Atlantic coast of Ireland that autumn was catastrophic. Somewhere between a third and half of the fleet that had sailed from Spain that spring never came back. Philip received the news at his desk in El Escorial. He did not rage. He said, "I sent my ships to fight against men, not against the wind and the waves." It was not a statement of denial. It was a statement from a man who had built his entire understanding of his role on a foundation he could not permit himself to question. He had done what he believed God required. The outcome was what God had decided. He would keep reading the papers and writing in the margins until the body gave out entirely. He died in September of 1598, in his bed in El Escorial, close enough to the monastery chapel that he could hear the monks singing. He had reigned for 42 years. He left his son an empire that was still the largest in the world on paper, and that was quietly developing problems that the paper did not fully record. In the royal nurseries of Madrid, in the children born to Philip's descendants, something was beginning to appear in the faces, not yet alarming, not yet the thing that would eventually become impossible to ignore. Just the early signs of what happens when a family spends too many generations being very careful about who they allow into the bloodline. Madrid, 1628. Diego Velázquez was 29 years old, and he had just been appointed court painter to King Philip IV of Spain. And he was standing in front of a canvas, trying to decide something. He was looking at the king's face, specifically at the jaw. The lower jaw pushed forward and downward in a way that made the mouth difficult to close completely. The upper and lower teeth meeting at an angle that nature had not designed for easy function. It was more pronounced than it had been in Philip III. It had been present in Philip II too, though in that face subtle enough that a painter with less integrity might have smoothed it away without anyone complaining. Velázquez was not a painter who smoothed things away. He was a painter who looked at what was actually in front of him and put it on the canvas with a directness that made his contemporaries uncomfortable and made his work immortal. He painted what he saw. The jaw went into the painting exactly as it was, what Velázquez was documenting, without the language of modern genetics to describe it, was the product of a system. The Spanish Habsburg branch had been managing their marriages for generations, with a specific and understandable goal: keeping the inheritance intact, keeping the bloodline connected to families that could be trusted, keeping the web of claims and rights and titles that made Habsburg power legitimate in the hands of people who would use it correctly. In practice, this meant marrying within a narrowing circle. Cousine, nieces, the daughters of uncles, each generation making careful calculations about who was an appropriate match and consistently arriving at answers that kept the circle small. A study conducted centuries later, using portraits of Habsburg family members and assessments by specialists in facial medicine, found a correlation between the degree of inbreeding across generations and the increasing prominence of the jaw characteristic. The researchers were careful about their conclusions, as they should have been, because a portrait is not an X-ray and historical figures cannot be examined directly. But the visual record across multiple generations told a consistent story, and the medical records of the period filled in what the portraits could not show. Philip III had been dominated by his ministers because he lacked the energy to dominate them himself. Philip IV was genuinely intelligent, a king who understood what was happening around him and found himself increasingly unable to affect it. He had 10 children with his first wife. 2 survived to adulthood. He had more children with his second wife. One survived. The infant mortality rate in 17th century Spain was high by any standard. Royal families had access to the best medical care available, which was better than what ordinary people could get, and still not very good by modern measures. But the pattern of deaths in the Spanish Habsburg nurseries went beyond what the period's ordinary losses explained. The narrowing marriage pool likely increased the risk of inherited disorders and poor health outcomes with each generation. Though individual diagnoses from records, this old must remain cautious. Velázquez documented all of it. His painting, Las Meninas, completed in 1656, puts the 5-year-old Infanta Margarita at the center of a group portrait that includes her ladies-in-waiting, 2 court dwarfs, a dog, and Velázquez himself reflected in a mirror at the back of the room. Margarita stands in the light with the careful posture of a child who has been trained from birth to stand correctly in public, wearing a dress that is essentially a small version of an adult court gown, looking out at the viewer with eyes that are watchful and slightly remote. She would be sent to Vienna to marry her uncle Leopold, her mother's brother. At 17, the painting was made when she was 5. Already she was being prepared. Philip IV died in 1665. His heir was Charles, his son by his second wife, Mariana of Austria, who was also his niece. Charles was 4 years old when he became king. He had been born in 1661. The royal physicians who attended his birth recorded their concerns in terms that became more serious as the child grew. He was slow to walk and slow to talk. His head was large. His tongue was large, which made eating difficult and speech difficult. The jaw was more pronounced than in any previous generation. Not just a family characteristic now, but something that affected basic function. The court managed the situation by managing information. Charles II of Spain was the king. The king was not to be described in terms that suggested weakness. Ambassadors from other courts learned quickly what they were and were not supposed to put in writing about what they observed. What they wrote anyway, in dispatches meant for their home governments, circulated among the European courts with the careful discretion of people who needed to know something they could not officially acknowledge. Knowing, everyone understood what was happening. The Spanish Habsburg line was ending. The question was not whether, but when, and more urgently. What happened to the largest empire in the world when the last man standing to inherit it could not properly close his mouth? Charles II reigned for 39 years. He showed up. He wore the crown. He sat on the throne and received ambassadors and signed documents and did the things that kings were required to do. He was married twice, to 2 different European princesses selected for their potential to produce an heir. Neither marriage produced a child. In the final years, the court organized religious ceremonies in his chambers. Charles submitted to them because he was a devout man, and because he did not know what else might work, and because the people around him had decided this was worth trying. He died in November of 1700. He was 38 years old. In his will, he left the Spanish Empire to Philip of Anjou, a grandson of Louis XIV of France, because the legal analysis of the succession concluded that Philip had the strongest claim. The choice triggered the War of the Spanish Succession, which lasted 13 years and rearranged the balance of power on the continent in ways that reverberated for the next century. The Spanish Habsburg line was over. In Vienna, the Austrian branch of the family had been watching. They had their own troubles, their own wars, their own pressures on every border. But they had also been watching what Madrid had demonstrated across 3 generations, what happened when a family tried to protect its inheritance by keeping it too close. Vienna had the advantage of learning from what Madrid had shown them. They did not learn all of it. Not fast enough. Not completely. History rarely allows for that kind of clean instruction. But the Austrian Habsburgs would survive the end of their Spanish cousins and continue for another 2 centuries. And the woman who would define what that survival looked like was not yet born. When she arrived, nobody would be ready for her. Vienna, September 12th, 1683. The Ottoman army had been outside the walls for 60 days. Inside the city, the food was running out. The wells were contaminated. Disease had moved through the civilian population and then through the garrison. The commander of the defense, Ernst Rüdiger von Starhemberg, had been sending messages out through the Ottoman lines by carrier pigeon, asking the same question in each one: where is the relief army, and when will it arrive? On the morning of September 12th, the answer came not by pigeon, but by the sound of cannon fire from the hills to the northwest. The relief army had arrived, Polish cavalry and German infantry, under the overall command of Jan Sobieski, the King of Poland, who had ridden through the night to get his forces into position. The battle lasted 1 day. The Ottoman lines broke in the late afternoon when Sobieski led a cavalry charge down from the Kahlenberg hill into the Ottoman camp. By evening the siege was over. The Ottoman army left behind their tents and their supplies, according to the stories that Viennese people told for generations afterward, their coffee, which the city's inhabitants discovered and developed an enthusiasm for that persists to the present day. Vienna had survived. The Ottoman Empire would never seriously threaten the city again, and what that survival made possible was something that had not quite existed in the same form before. Vienna was not ruling one people. It was learning to rule many Germans, Hungarians, Czechs, Croats, Italians, Poles, and others whose loyalties and languages and histories did not always fit neatly beneath one crown. After 1683, when the existential threat from the east receded, the city began to express something beyond the military fact of its survival. It began to build. The Hofburg, the imperial palace in the center of the city, expanded continuously through the late 17th and early 18th centuries, adding wings and courtyards and ceremonial spaces that turned it from a functional fortress into a statement. Schönbrunn, the summer palace outside the city, was rebuilt on a scale that was intended to rival Versailles. The palace Louis XIV of France was constructing at the same time as a declaration of French supremacy. The rivalry between Vienna and Paris was not just military and diplomatic. It was architectural. Both courts understood that what you built said something about who you were. The music came with the building. The Habsburg court had always had musicians. After 1683, it had an institution. The court employed composers and performers at a level that made Vienna the most musically active court in Europe. Emperors competed with each other in the ambition of their musical patronage. The city was becoming something that people traveled to, that people talked about, that people wanted to be part of, not because of what it had conquered, but because of what it had created. A boy would come to Schönbrunn one afternoon in 1762 and play the harpsichord for the Empress, and then slip on the polished floor and be helped up by the Empress herself and declare that he intended to marry her. His name was Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart. He was 6 years old. The Empress laughed. The story was recorded because it was charming, and because the boy would become something extraordinary, and because the moment captured something true about what Vienna had become, a city where the court and the culture were close enough together that a child prodigy could end up in the Empress's lap. But that Empress, Maria Theresa, still lay in the future. Before her came the problem that made her necessary. Charles VI became Holy Roman Emperor in 1711, the last male heir of the Austrian Habsburg line. He had daughters but no sons, and the laws governing succession in the Habsburg territories had not been written with daughters in mind. He spent the better part of his reign solving this problem through diplomacy. The document he produced was called the Pragmatic Sanction, and it changed the rules of Habsburg inheritance to allow female succession, meaning that his daughter could inherit his territories even though she was not a son. Getting the major European powers to agree to this required years of negotiation and significant concessions in other areas. One by one they signed. France signed. Prussia signed. Britain signed. The great powers of Europe put their names to the document and guaranteed that when Charles died, his daughter would inherit without challenge. Charles died on October 20th, 1740. His daughter, Maria Theresa, was 23 years old, pregnant with her first child, and the heir to a territory that every signatory of the Pragmatic Sanction immediately began planning to take pieces of. Frederick II of Prussia moved first. His army crossed into Silesia, one of the most economically valuable provinces in the Habsburg territory, without a declaration of war. Bavaria and France began coordinating. Spain had claims it was interested in revisiting the Pragmatic Sanction. It turned out was worth approximately as much as the paper it was written on when the signatories decided that a young pregnant woman was not going to be able to stop them from taking what they wanted. The young pregnant woman had other ideas. Hofburg Palace, Vienna, October 1740. The room smelled of candles and paper, and something underneath both of those things that was harder to name. Maria Theresa sat at her father's desk. He had been dead for less than a week. The papers on the desk were his papers. The correspondence and documents and unresolved business of an emperor who had spent his last years trying to arrange the world so that his daughter could inherit it safely. The arrangement had not held, she wrote in her memoirs. Years later, describing this period in terms that were careful and honest in equal measure, she found herself, she wrote, without money, without credit, without an army, without experience, and without counsel. She was the ruler of a territory being carved up by her neighbors while she was pregnant with her first child. The men who were supposed to advise her were either paralyzed by the situation or quietly calculating which way to position themselves depending on how the next few months went. She was scared. She said so. In writing, which was not something that rulers in her position typically did. And then she kept going anyway. The first crisis was Frederick of Prussia and Silesia. Frederick had seized the province before Maria Theresa had time to organize a response. When she sent diplomats to negotiate its return, he was polite and firm and not interested. Silesia was economically important, and he had it. And the conversation about giving it back would need to be conducted in a different language than the one diplomats used. Maria Theresa understood what kind of language he meant. She began rebuilding the Austrian military, which her father had allowed to deteriorate while he spent his energy and his money on the diplomatic effort to secure the Pragmatic Sanction. She reorganized the tax system. She reached out to every ally she could identify, including some that her father had treated as secondary relationships. The most important of these was Hungary. Hungary was a kingdom under Habsburg rule, but not a simple part of the Habsburg state. The Hungarian nobility had their own traditions, and their own understanding of the relationship between the crown and the people who served it. And that understanding included the right to be consulted on matters that affected them. Maria Theresa had spent years watching her father manage the Hungarian relationship with varying degrees of success. In September of 1741, she appeared before the Hungarian Diet at Pressburg. She wore mourning clothes because her father was recently dead. She held her infant son Joseph in her arms. She spoke to the assembled Hungarian nobility in Latin, the official language of the Hungarian state, and she told them the truth. The empire her father had left her was in danger, and she did not have the resources to defend it alone, and she was asking for their help. This moment has been described in various ways by various sources, and like many decisive historical moments, it has accumulated some drama in the retelling. What is documented is the outcome. The Hungarian nobility voted to provide military support. The phrase that came from that meeting, "Moriamur pro rege nostro," "Let us die for our king," was spoken with a female monarch in mind. And the use of the male form of king rather than queen said something about the gap between what the language had been built to express and what the political reality had now produced. 40,000 Hungarian troops. It was not enough to recover Silesia. The War of the Austrian Succession lasted 8 years and ended with a peace that left Silesia in Prussian hands permanently. Maria Theresa never stopped considering that wound open. For the rest of her reign, she pursued the recovery of Silesia as a diplomatic and then a military objective, reversing the century-old Austrian hostility toward France, constructing the framework for what would become the 7 Years' War. She did not get Silesia back, but she built, in the effort, something more durable than a province, a more professional military, a more efficient administration, a court that functioned differently than the one she had inherited, and a reputation, earned across 8 years of fighting that nobody had expected her to survive. As someone who could not be dismissed simply because she was a woman, her relationship with Frederick of Prussia across 4 decades was one of the defining antagonisms of 18th century European politics. They went to war 3 times. Frederick called her the most formidable of his enemies and expressed this in a phrase that was a compliment wrapped around an insult, saying she was the only man among them. She called him the wicked man of Saxony in her private correspondence. The animosity between them was genuine, and it was also, from a certain angle, a kind of respect between 2 people who understood each other's intelligence and could not afford to underestimate it. Maria Theresa reigned for 40 years. She reformed the Habsburg educational system, establishing public schools and compulsory attendance in a period when most European governments had not considered education a state responsibility. She reformed the tax system to require the nobility to pay taxes for the first time, overcoming resistance that previous emperors had simply declined to engage with. She reorganized the military on the Prussian model because Frederick's army had beaten hers, and she was practical enough to learn from the thing that had beaten her. She was also a woman who experienced the contradiction at the center of her position every day without ever fully resolving it, because it could not be resolved, only managed. She ran an empire. She had 16 children, and those 16 children were not separate from the empire. They were part of it, instruments of policy, in the way that every Habsburg child had been an instrument of policy since Maximilian first began working out the mathematics of strategic marriage. The emotion she felt for them was genuine. The use she made of them was also genuine. In the world she inhabited, those 2 things were not in contradiction. They were the same thing, braided together so tightly that pulling them apart would have destroyed both. One of her daughters had red hair and a quick intelligence and a lightness of manner that the Viennese court found charming, and that would turn out to be poorly suited to the world she was about to be sent into. Her name was Maria Antonia. In France, she would be called Marie Antoinette. Schönbrunn Palace, Vienna, 1762. A 6-year-old boy had just finished playing the harpsichord and was sliding across the polished floor of the great hall when he lost his footing and went down hard. Maria Theresa crossed the room and helped him up. The boy climbed into her lap, looked at her with the complete confidence of a child who has not yet learned to be intimidated by power, and announced that he intended to marry her. She laughed. She had not laughed easily in recent years. The boy's name was Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart. His father Leopold had brought him and his older sister Nannerl to Vienna to perform for the court, and the performance had been everything Leopold had promised. The Empress sent the family gifts afterward, and the afternoon passed into the kind of story that gets told and retold until it becomes part of what a city remembers about itself. What the story captures, beyond its charm, is something true about the Vienna that Maria Theresa had built. It was a city where that kind of afternoon was possible, where the court and the culture existed close enough together that a carpenter's son, with extraordinary gifts, could end up performing for the most powerful woman in Europe and being received with genuine warmth. The formality was real. The hierarchy was real. And inside all of that, there was something alive, something that made people feel. Vienna was a place where things were happening that mattered. Maria Theresa had 16 children. She knew the name and the specific temperament and the particular fears of every one of them. She wrote to them constantly after they left Vienna, letters that mixed the practical and the personal in a way that made them unlike almost any other royal correspondence of the period. She told them what to eat and how to hold themselves in public and what their responsibilities were to the people who served them. She asked about their health and their sleep and whether they were happy, knowing that happiness was not something she could guarantee any of them, and asking anyway because she was their mother, and that was what mothers asked. She was also an empress who understood that each of those 16 children represented something beyond themselves. Her eldest son, Joseph, would become co-ruler with her in 1765 after the death of her husband, Francis Stephen, and the relationship between them would be one of the defining tensions of her later reign. Joseph was impatient in the way that intelligent people who have been waiting a long time to act tend to be impatient. He wanted to reform everything, immediately, without the consultation and gradual management of resistance that his mother had spent 40 years learning was necessary. She found him exhausting. He found her too slow. They argued in writing with the thoroughness of two people who respected each other and could not agree on almost anything practical. Her daughter, Maria Christina, was the one she loved most openly. And she let Maria Christina do something she did not let the others do, choose her own husband. Albert of Saxony-Teschen was not the most strategically valuable match available. He was a suitable match, a reasonable match, a match that could be defended at any European court. And Maria Christina wanted him, and Maria Theresa said yes. The other daughters noticed. The letters they wrote to each other about this particular piece of maternal favoritism have the unmistakable quality of siblings who feel the inequity of a parent's love and cannot entirely blame the parent for it. Marie Antoinette was the 15th child. She had been born in 1755. Bright and charming and not, by the standards of the rigorous Habsburg educational program, a particularly serious student. She spoke French and German, but not fluently in either. She played the harpsichord adequately, She danced beautifully, which turned out to matter more than anyone predicted. She had a quality that later observers would struggle to define precisely, but that everyone who met her in her youth seemed to recognize immediately. She was easy to be around. Rooms lightened when she entered them. In Versailles, this gift would become a complication. The marriage had been in planning since she was a child. France and Austria had been enemies for most of the previous 2 centuries. The ancient rivalry between Bourbon and Habsburg that had shaped the politics of the continent since the time of Charles V. In 1756, Maria Theresa had engineered a reversal of those century-old alliances that brought Austria and France together. The marriage of Marie Antoinette to the French Dauphin was the human seal on that diplomatic transformation. Maria Theresa prepared her daughter with the thoroughness she brought to everything. Tutors were employed. The girl's French was improved. A full set of instructions was compiled about how to behave at Versailles, what the French expected from their future queen, what mistakes to avoid, what relationships to cultivate. The instructions were detailed and practical and reflected 40 years of experience managing a court and a country. They could not prepare Marie Antoinette for what was actually coming. Not because Maria Theresa was not thorough enough, because what was coming was not something any preparation for the world as it existed could have addressed. The world as it existed was about to stop existing. The farewell happened in April of 1770. Marie Antoinette was 14 years old. The ceremony at Schönbrunn was formal and public in the way that all Habsburg ceremonies were formal and public. Every emotion managed and shaped by the requirements of the occasion. And then, by multiple accounts, it stopped being managed. Maria Theresa held her daughter and wept. Marie Antoinette wept. The Empress, who had governed 40 million people with the precision of a woman who had been doing it since she was 23 years old, stood in a palace corridor and cried because her child was leaving and she was never going to see her again. She knew this. She had done it before, with other children, other departures, other border crossings into other countries, where her children would live out their lives as instruments of Habsburg policy and human beings who missed their home. She knew what the distances meant in the 18th century. She knew that a crisis in Versailles could destroy someone before Vienna even knew it had started. She wiped her eyes and let her daughter go. She wrote to her afterward almost every month. The letters from Vienna were warm and specific and full of advice that the girl in Versailles was not always in a position to follow. The letters from Versailles were affectionate and sometimes several months late, which drove Maria Theresa into a combination of maternal worry and imperial frustration that produced some of the most honest correspondence in the Habsburg archive. Maria Theresa died in November of 1780, 63 years old. After a reign of 40 years, she had transformed the Habsburg state from the inside, built the institutions and the administration and the educational system that would carry it forward for another century and a half. She had outlasted Frederick of Prussia as a political force, even without recovering Silesia. She had raised 16 children and placed them across the courts of Europe like a hand of cards, played with great skill across a very long game. She did not live to see what happened in Paris. That was perhaps the one mercy the timing of her death provided. The Rhine River, May 1772. There was an island in the middle of the river between France and Austria, and on that island there was a building that had been constructed specifically for this moment and would never be used for anything else. It was called the Handover Pavilion. The idea behind it was that a young woman crossing from one country to another to become its queen should make that crossing completely. leaving nothing of her old life on the other side. The ceremony required Marie Antoinette to surrender everything she had brought from Vienna: her clothes, her jewelry, her books, even her small dog, which she had been allowed to bring as far as the island, and was not allowed to bring further. She was 14 years old. She stood in the pavilion and took off the clothes she had worn from Vienna and put on the clothes that France had sent for her. The Austrian attendants who had travelled with her were not permitted to cross into France. The French attendants who would accompany her for the rest of her life were waiting on the other side. The ceremony treated the process of transforming a girl from Austrian to French as something that could be accomplished in an afternoon by removing one set of possessions and replacing them with another. The girl who crossed the Rhine into France that afternoon was not French. She would spend the next 23 years never being quite French enough for the people who had decided she was not French enough, and never quite Austrian enough to receive the help that her mother's country might have offered if the distances had been shorter and the politics less complicated. Versailles was the most elaborate stage set in Europe, a palace designed by Louis XIV to express the absolute supremacy of the French crown over everything around it. Every inch of it communicated hierarchy and precedence, and the careful management of who was allowed to stand where, in relation to whom. The etiquette was not decoration. It was the mechanism by which power was distributed and withheld, and mastering it was the primary skill required of anyone who wanted to function in that environment. Marie Antoinette arrived at Versailles at 14, speaking French with an accent that court observers noted and privately mocked. Married to a 16-year-old boy named Louis, who was kind and well-intentioned, and overwhelmed by the machinery of the French court in ways that made him a poor guide to navigating it. Louis would become Louis XVI. He was intelligent in the way that people who read widely and think carefully are intelligent, and he was not intelligent in the way that the position required, which demanded the ability to make decisions quickly and project confidence even in the absence of certainty. He was a good man who became king at the worst possible time. Marie Antoinette understood this about her husband earlier than he understood it about himself. What she had, in the absence of political influence, was the one domain that Versailles allowed her, the management of her own immediate world, her clothes, her rooms, her entertainments, the small court of friends and companions that formed around her and provided the warmth and lightness that the formal machinery of Versailles did not. She spent money on these things, not extravagantly by the standards of the French court, which had been spending extravagantly for a century before she arrived, extravagantly by the standards of the French people, who were increasingly aware of the gap between their lives and the life being lived at Versailles, and who needed a face to put on the problem. They found hers convenient, Madame Deficit. The nickname spread through the pamphlets and the songs and the conversations of a Paris that was hungry and angry and looking for reasons. The calculation was not entirely fair. The French state's financial crisis had origins that predated Marie Antoinette's arrival and would have developed without her spending habits contributing anything to them. But fairness was not the question. The question was narrative, and the narrative required a face. And a foreign queen who bought too many dresses was a more satisfying face than the accumulated structural problems of a feudal tax system that exempted the people with money from contributing to the state that protected their money. Marie Antoinette did not know how ordinary French people lived, not because she was cruel or indifferent, because she had never been permitted to know. Versailles was a sealed world, and she had been placed inside it at 14, and the seal had held. She was not ignoring the suffering outside the palace walls. She was genuinely unaware of its dimensions, which was a different kind of failure, and in some ways a more complete one, because ignorance cannot be corrected by good intentions alone. The revolution, when it came faster than anyone inside Versailles had managed to understand it was coming. The events of 1789 moved with a speed that left the court perpetually behind. By the time the full picture was clear, the picture had already changed again. The March on Versailles, in October of 1789, brought thousands of women from Paris to the palace, demanding bread and demanding the royal family come to the city where they could be watched. The royal family came. They were installed in the Tuileries Palace in Paris, comfortable prisoners in a cage whose bars became more visible as the political situation deteriorated month by month. The attempt to escape France in June of 1791 failed when the royal family was recognized at a posting station near the border and returned to Paris under guard. The failure of the escape changed everything. It provided the revolutionary government with the evidence it had been accumulating of a royal family that was not loyal to France, that was looking to foreign powers for rescue. The evidence was real. The royal family had been doing exactly what the revolutionaries suspected. The king was tried and executed in January of 1793. Marie Antoinette was tried in October of the same year. The charges included treason and conspiracy with foreign enemies of France. There was also a charge involving her son, an accusation with no evidentiary basis that the prosecutors introduced for the effect it produced, rather than for any relationship to facts. Marie Antoinette had been in prison for months. She had been separated from her children. She had watched her husband go to the guillotine. She was thin and ill, and her hair had gone white in the months since her arrest. When the accusation involving her son was read out, she did not respond immediately. She sat with it for a moment. Then she turned not to her accusers but to the women sitting in the public gallery of the court, the ordinary French women who had come to watch the trial, and she said that nature itself refused to respond to such a charge against any mother. She appealed to every mother present. The courtroom went quiet. It was the only moment in the trial where the political machinery that had produced it paused long enough for something human to get through. For one moment, the symbol and the person became the same thing, and the women in the gallery felt it, and the room was quiet. She was convicted. The verdict had been determined before the trial began. Marie Antoinette was executed on October 16th, 1793. She was 37 years old. She had been in France for 23 years, more than half her life. On the cart to the Place de la Révolution, she accidentally stepped on the foot of the executioner and said, "Excuse me, I did not do it on purpose." The politeness was real. It was the reflex of a woman who had been trained from childhood to manage every social interaction correctly. And the training had gone deep enough that it was still operating at the moment when no training could have been more beside the point. The world that Marie Antoinette had been sent into France to help sustain was already gone by the time she died. The question now was whether the family that had sent her there would survive the world that replaced it. The answer would depend on a man who was already winning battles in Italy, at a speed that made the military thinking of every European court look dangerously out of date. Vienna, August 11th, 1804. Francis II of the House of Habsburg sat at his desk and did something that no member of his family had done in 1,000 years. He gave himself a new title. The proclamation he signed that morning declared him Francis I, Emperor of Austria. It was a new title for a new reality, created specifically because an old reality was becoming impossible to maintain. The Holy Roman Empire, the institution that had given the Habsburgs their highest claim to authority since the time of Rudolf I, was dying. Napoleon Bonaparte was killing it, not with a single decisive blow, but with the sustained pressure of a man who understood that old structures collapse faster when you stop pretending they are still standing. 2 years later, on August 6, 1806, Francis signed a second document. He abdicated as Holy Roman Emperor and dissolved the empire itself, freeing its member states from their obligations to an institution that had existed in some form since Charlemagne was crowned in Rome on Christmas Day in the year 800, more than 1,000 years. Gone, because the alternative was allowing Napoleon to claim the title himself and strip it from the Habsburgs publicly, which would have been worse than dissolving it themselves. Francis chose the controlled collapse over the humiliating one. It was a very Habsburg decision. Napoleon had moved through Europe at a pace that the military, thinking of the 18th century, had not prepared anyone to defend against. He combined the elements of warfare that previous commanders had treated as sequential into something simultaneous and relentless. Austrian armies, built and trained on the assumption of a certain tempo, found themselves fighting an opponent who operated on a completely different one. Marengo in 1800, Ulm in 1805, Austerlitz in December of 1805, which was Napoleon's masterpiece, a battle in which he defeated the combined Austrian and Russian armies so completely that the peace terms signed afterward cost Austria territory that had taken generations to accumulate. Francis met with Napoleon after Austerlitz and sat across from the man who had just destroyed his army. By the accounts of people who were present, Francis was composed. He had been absorbing losses that required composing oneself about for his entire reign. He had learned to take the hit without letting the taking show on his face. What happened next was stranger than the warfare, because it was more personal. Napoleon wanted legitimacy in a way that military victory could not fully provide. He had made himself Emperor of the French in 1804, crowning himself in Notre Dame in a ceremony where the Pope was present, but where Napoleon placed the crown on his own head to make clear that his authority came from himself and not from the Church. Kings and emperors derived their authority from bloodlines that stretched back centuries. Napoleon's bloodline stretched back to a minor family from Corsica. By the standards of the European aristocracy, he was a nobody who had made himself a somebody through the force of his own will. What could legitimize him in the eyes of that aristocracy was a Habsburg. He divorced Josephine, who had not given him an heir, and sent a proposal to Vienna. He wanted to marry Marie-Louise, the daughter of Francis I, the niece of Marie Antoinette, a girl of 18 whose dynasty was the oldest in Europe and whose bloodline was exactly what he needed. Francis agreed. The man who had beaten his armies at Marengo and Ulm and Austerlitz was asking to marry his daughter. Refusing was possible only if you were willing to accept the consequences of refusing. The Habsburg response to impossible situations had always been to find the angle that preserved the maximum amount of what mattered and concede the minimum necessary to survive. Giving Napoleon a Habsburg wife preserved Austria. It cost a daughter. The wedding took place in April of 1810. Napoleon was 40. Marie-Louise was 18. She bore him a son, Napoleon II, the heir he had divorced Josephine to obtain. The boy was given the title King of Rome at birth. Napoleon had destroyed the Holy Roman Empire. Then he married into the family that had defined it and named his son King of Rome. Clemens von Metternich became Austrian foreign minister in 1809. After the defeat at Wagram, forced another humiliating peace on Austria. He was 36 years old, elegant and calculating, with a talent for reading political situations that operated at a different level from the military talent Napoleon possessed. Napoleon could win battles. Metternich could read trajectories. He looked at Napoleon's position in 1812 the year of the Russian campaign. And he saw something that Napoleon apparently could not see, an overextended empire being asked to do too much with too little. A general who had begun to believe that his own judgment was infallible. An army being consumed in a country too large and too cold and too indifferent to be consumed by anyone. When the Russian campaign collapsed and Napoleon retreated across Europe with the remnants of his army, Metternich moved Austria from neutral to actively opposed. He did it at exactly the right moment. Napoleon was exiled to Elba in April of 1814, returned for the 100 Days in 1815, was defeated at Waterloo, and was exiled again to St. Helena in the South Atlantic, where he died in 1821. Napoleon's son, the King of Rome, grew up in Vienna after his father's exile. Marie-Louise returned to Austria with the boy, and Francis raised his grandson in the Habsburg court, the only court the child had access to since Napoleon was never allowed to see him again. The boy was given an Austrian title, the Duke of Reichstadt, and an Austrian education. He died of pneumonia at 21 in Vienna, the Habsburg inheritance completing itself over the body of the Napoleonic one. The Congress of Vienna, which ran from September of 1814 to June of 1815, redraws the map of Europe after Napoleon. It met in Vienna because Metternich wanted it there, and the great powers sent their representatives, and Metternich orchestrated the proceedings with the skill of a man who had been thinking about European stability since before Napoleon made instability his primary tool. What the Congress produced was a settlement built on restoring legitimate monarchies and suppressing the forces that had made Napoleon possible: nationalism, liberalism, the idea that peoples had the right to organize their own governments on the basis of popular will rather than dynastic inheritance. The settlement worked for a generation. It kept the major European powers from fighting each other for 40 years. It did not resolve the underlying tensions it was designed to suppress. It could not. The ideas that the French Revolution had released into the world had been moving through Europe for 25 years. They could be managed. They could be delayed. They could not be uninvented. In 1848, they arrived everywhere at once. In Vienna, the man who had managed the old order for 39 years climbed into a laundry cart and fled the city while the crowds were still in the streets. Metternich was 74 years old. He had built the most durable conservative order in European history. It had not been durable enough. From his window, in the Hofburg, as the noise from the streets below rose and the old certainties shook, the Emperor Ferdinand I turned to the advisers around him and asked a question that the people present never forgot. He asked, "But is it permitted?" It was a very Habsburg question, and the answer being given in the streets below was a very modern one. Vienna, December 2nd, 1848. The young man standing in the throne room of the Hofburg was 18 years old, and he had just been told he was the Emperor of Austria. His name was Franz Joseph. His uncle Ferdinand had abdicated the day before, bypassing Franz Joseph's father in a decision made by the family council on the grounds that the father was unsuitable and the son was not. Franz Joseph had been prepared for this possibility in the way that Habsburg heirs were prepared for things, through education and ceremony and the gradual accumulation of responsibility. He had not been prepared for this specific morning, this specific room, the specific weight of what was being placed on him while the city outside was still unsettled from the revolution that had driven Metternich out and forced Ferdinand to agree to a constitution and brought Austrian troops into conflict. with Hungarian forces who wanted something the Habsburgs were not prepared to give. He would reign for 68 years. That number is difficult to hold in the mind. 68 years is longer than most people live. Franz Joseph became emperor before the invention of the telephone, before the invention of the internal combustion engine, before the American Civil War. He was still emperor when airplanes existed, when automobiles were common on Viennese streets, when the first motion pictures had been showing for 20 years. He lived through the transformation of the world from one thing into something else entirely. And he responded to that transformation the same way every time by getting up at 4 in the morning, putting on his uniform, sitting down at his desk, and working. He was a man of absolute routine in an age that was dismantling the routines of centuries. He ate simple food. He slept on a military cot rather than the elaborate beds available to him. He did not like Wagner. He did not understand telephones and did not want one in his office. He wore his uniform to everything, formal events and working days and family dinners alike. The uniform was not affectation. It was a statement about who he understood himself to be: a soldier in the service of a dynasty, performing a duty that was not about personal comfort or preference, but about fulfilling an obligation to something larger than himself. His empire, by the middle of the 19th century, was not one thing. It was Germans and Hungarians and Czechs and Croats and Slovens and Slovaks and Poles and Romanians and Italians and Serbs and a dozen smaller populations, all living under one crown, all governed from Vienna, all increasingly aware that the world around them was organizing itself on a principle that the Habsburg system was built to resist. That principle was the nation-state, the idea that people who shared a language and a culture and a historical memory should have their own government, their own army, their own flag, their own story about themselves that did not require an Austrian emperor at the center of it. The revolutions of 1848 had been expressions of that idea. Hungarian nationalists had wanted Hungarian self-governance. Italian nationalists in the Habsburg-controlled northern Italian territories had wanted unification with the rest of Italy. Czech nationalists had wanted recognition of Czech political identity. Franz Joseph suppressed all of it, some of it militarily, with Russian help in Hungary, and the suppression worked in the short term and resolved nothing in the long term, because the ideas behind the revolts were not the kind of ideas that go away when the armies go home. The losses accumulated in ways that would have broken a man less committed to the performance of duty. In 1853, a Hungarian nationalist attacked Franz Joseph on the city walls of Vienna, slashing at his neck with a knife. The wound was serious. A passing military officer intervened. Franz Joseph recovered and returned to work, and did not change his habits of walking relatively unguarded in public, because changing his habits in response to an attack would have been an acknowledgement that the attack had affected him. His brother Maximilian was a more complicated loss. Maximilian was charming and romantic in ways that Franz Joseph was not. And when Napoleon III of France proposed installing a European monarch as Emperor of Mexico, Maximilian went. The French troops that had made his position possible were withdrawn when American pressure made maintaining them too costly. Without French troops, Maximilian's empire evaporated. He was captured by Republican forces and executed by firing squad in June of 1867. He was 34 years old. Franz Joseph received the news and went back to work. In 1866, Austria fought Prussia and lost, decisively, at the Battle of Königgrätz, a defeat that effectively ended Austrian influence over the German states and made Prussian dominance of German-speaking Europe a matter of time. The peace terms were not as punishing as they might have been. partly because Bismarck was smart enough to know that a humiliated Austria was more dangerous than a merely defeated one. But the strategic consequences were enormous. The response was the Compromise of 1867, the Ausgleich, the arrangement that transformed the Habsburg Empire into the Austro-Hungarian Empire, a dual monarchy with Austria and Hungary as co-equal partners, each with their own parliament and prime minister, sharing a monarch, a foreign policy, and a military. Franz Joseph became simultaneously Emperor of Austria and King of Hungary, crowned in Budapest in a separate ceremony with the medieval crown of St. Stephen, a gesture toward Hungarian historical identity that the Habsburgs had been refusing for decades and could no longer afford to refuse. The compromise was an elegant solution to an impossible problem, and it created, in solving the immediate problem, a set of longer-term problems that it did not solve. The other nationalities in the empire, the Czechs and the Croats and the Slovenes and the Poles and the Romanians, watched the Hungarians receive their special status and wanted their own. The Hungarians who had received it were not interested in sharing it with anyone else. The empire had bought itself 50 years by satisfying one group's demands in a way that made every other group's demands more urgent. Franz Joseph managed all of it. He managed the empire with the thoroughness and the emotional restraint of a man who had decided very early that his personal feelings were not relevant to the exercise of his responsibilities, and that the exercise of his responsibilities was all that mattered. His wife did not agree with this approach. Her name was Elizabeth. Everyone called her Sisi, and she was about to demonstrate to the most powerful man in Central Europe something that no army had ever managed to demonstrate to him, that there were things in this world that duty could not hold together. Schönbrunn Palace, Vienna, summer 1860. Elizabeth stood on the scale and noted the number. This was a daily ritual, documented in the records of her household staff with the precision that the imperial court brought to everything that touched the empress. Her waist measurement was recorded with the same regularity. The numbers were maintained within a range so narrow across so many years that the consistency itself was a kind of achievement, the product of hours of daily exercise, a diet that her physicians found alarming and that she declined to modify, and a will directed at her own body with an intensity that had no other outlet in the life she had been given. She had arrived in Vienna at 16 to marry Franz Joseph, and the story of how that marriage came to be was itself a small illustration of the gap between what the Habsburg system planned and what human beings actually did inside it. Franz Joseph had been sent to Bad Ischl in the summer of 1853 to meet Helene of Bavaria, Elizabeth's older sister, who had been identified as a suitable match for the emperor. Helene was the one who had been prepared for the meeting. But Franz Joseph met Elizabeth and could not think about anyone else. And since Franz Joseph was the emperor, the family adjusted its thinking accordingly. Elizabeth was 15 at Bad Ischl, playful and outdoors-oriented, and completely unprepared for what she was walking into. She liked riding horses and reading poetry, and being outside. The Viennese court contained her with a thoroughness that Marie Antoinette would have recognized. The problem was Franz Joseph's mother, the Archduchess Sophie, who had been running the Habsburg court since she had engineered her son's accession in 1848, and who had no intention of yielding that management to a teenage girl from Bavaria. Sophie made decisions about how the imperial couple's children were to be raised. She organized the household. She determined the schedule. She was not cruel to Elizabeth in any dramatic sense. She simply treated her as a component of the imperial system, rather than as a person with her own judgments about her own life. and Elizabeth found this intolerable in a way she could not directly confront and could not make herself accept. The response was the one available to her absence. Elizabeth began travelling. Hungary, where she was genuinely popular and where the complicated feelings about the Habsburgs left room for warmth toward an empress who seemed to find Vienna as confining as they did. Madeira, for her health, for months at a time. Corfu, where she eventually built a villa she named after Achilles, after the Greek hero who chose a short, glorious life over a long, ordinary one. England, for the riding, because she was one of the finest equestrians in Europe, and England had horses and hunts that challenged her in ways the Vienna woods did not. Franz Joseph wrote to her every day when she was away. The letters were regular and warm and specific. The letters of a man who paid close attention to the person he was writing to and wanted her to know it. They were not always answered with equal regularity. He accepted this with the patience he brought to everything. The patience of a man who had learned that many things in his life were not going to be what he wanted them to be, and that continuing anyway was the only response available to him. He loved her in the way that men who are not built for the expression of emotion love people. They cannot stop thinking about quietly, consistently, and in ways that only became fully visible after she was gone. Their son Rudolf was born in 1858, the Crown Prince, the heir to everything Franz Joseph had spent his reign managing and protecting. Rudolf was intelligent in a way that made the adults around him slightly uncomfortable from a young age. Quick and curious and full of questions that the imperial household did not always have satisfying answers to. He grew up into a young man who read widely and thought carefully and found himself in a position that was, when he examined it honestly, impossible. He was the heir to an empire that he believed needed fundamental reform. He had specific ideas about what that reform should look like, a more federal structure that gave the various nationalities genuine autonomy, a foreign policy less dependent on the German alliance, a domestic political life that made room for the liberal ideas reshaping the rest of Europe. He had written some of these ideas down, anonymously, in newspaper articles that circulated in Vienna among readers who did not know they were reading the Crown Prince's views. He could not implement any of it. He was the heir, not the emperor. Franz Joseph was the emperor, and Franz Joseph's view of what the empire needed was different from Rudolf's view, and the emperor's view was the one that determined policy. Rudolf had the intelligence to see the problem clearly and the powerlessness to do anything about it, which is a combination that tends to produce a particular kind of internal pressure that has to go somewhere. It went into alcohol, into morphine, which he had been introduced to for pain management and which he found managed other things as well, into a series of relationships outside his marriage that the court knew about and managed around, into a correspondence with a young woman named Mary Vetsera, 17 years old, who had attached herself to him with a completeness that the people around him found alarming. On January 30th, 1889, Rudolf and Mary Vetsera were found dead at his hunting lodge at Meiling, 30 kilometers south of Vienna. The court's first response was concealment. The circumstances were managed, the information controlled, the public narrative shaped toward the least damaging version of events. Most historians who have examined the evidence understand Meiling as a murder and a suicide, Rudolf's last act of agency in a life that had felt increasingly without it. He was 30 years old. He had been the Crown Prince since birth, and he had run out of ways to keep going. Franz Joseph received the news from his wife. He sat with it for a moment, that the people present described as longer than usual. Then he returned to work, because returning to work was the only language he had for continuing, and continuing was the only response he knew how to make. Elizabeth was never the same after Mayerling. She had already been retreating from Vienna, from the court, from everything the Habsburg world required of her. After her son's death, the retreat became something more absolute. She dressed in black for the rest of her life. She traveled more, stayed in fewer places, moved with the restlessness of someone who was not looking for a destination but could not stop. She was in Geneva in September of 1898, staying at a hotel on the lake, preparing to board a steamship. She was 60 years old. A young Italian anarchist named Luigi Lucchini had come to Geneva specifically to attack a member of the European aristocracy. Any member, as a political statement against everything they represented. He stabbed Elizabeth with a sharpened file as she walked along the lakeside, a weapon so small and the blow so quick that she did not understand what had happened. She straightened up. She took a few more steps. Then she collapsed. The wound had pierced her heart. She died within the hour. Franz Joseph received the news in Vienna. The people who were with him recorded that he sat down and was quiet for a long time, longer than was his habit. He said, "So nothing is to be spared me in this world." Then he sat a while longer. Then he went back to work. Every empire has two stories running at the same time. The story on the outside, with its battles and its borders and its treaties, and the story on the inside, with its closed doors and its conversations that never happened, and its people who could not find each other across the distance that power creates. The Habsburg Empire in the years approaching the 20th century was coming apart on both levels. But only the people inside the family could see the private one, and the man who had been placed in the middle of the family's hopes after Rudolf died was not someone anyone had chosen. He was the heir circumstances had produced, and he was about to become the most famous victim of an empire that had run out of ways to hold itself together. Vienna, February 1889. The morning after the news from Mayerling reached the Hofburg, while the court was still managing its response and the emperor was already back at his desk, someone had to update the document that listed the order of succession to the Habsburg throne. Rudolf's name was removed. The name that moved into position was Archduke Franz Ferdinand, the son of Franz Joseph's brother, Karl Ludwig. He was 25 years old. He had not been prepared for this. He had been living the life of an archduke, which involved military service and ceremonial obligations, and enough freedom to develop his own interests and opinions, without the complete suppression of personality that came with being the designated heir. He was not easy to like. The people who worked with him over the years accumulated a consistent set of impressions: impatient, direct to the point of rudeness, inflexible when he believed he was right, capable of genuine warmth with people he trusted, and cold with everyone else. His temper was documented by enough sources across enough years that it could not be attributed to bad days. It was his baseline, and the people who served him learned to read the signs and adjust accordingly. What the standard account of Franz Ferdinand tends to miss, because his death makes him a symbol rather than a person in most tellings, is the substance of his political thinking. He had ideas about the empire that were more specific and more developed than anything Rudolf had managed to put into practice. The core idea was federalism. Franz Ferdinand believed the empire's fundamental problem was that it had resolved the question of nationalities in 1867 by giving the Hungarians a privileged position that every other nationality resented. The solution, in his view, was not to undo the Hungarian arrangement, but to extend its logic. to create a genuinely federal structure in which the Slavic populations of the empire, the Czechs and the Croats and the Slovenes and the Serbs within Habsburg borders, had their own recognized political status alongside the Austrians and the Hungarians. This idea made him enemies in multiple directions simultaneously. The Hungarians opposed it because it would reduce their privileged position. The German nationalists in Austria opposed it because it elevated Slavic peoples to a status they did not want them to have. And the Serbian nationalists outside the empire opposed it for a reason that was not always stated clearly, but that was real, if Franz Ferdinand's federalism worked. If it gave the Slavic peoples within the empire something genuinely worth belonging to, it would undercut the appeal of a greater Serbian nationalism that depended on Slavic dissatisfaction for its energy. A satisfied South Slav inside Austria-Hungary was the enemy of everyone who wanted those people outside it. The personal situation was simpler and more human, and in some ways more revealing of the man than any of his political ideas. He fell in love with Sophie Chotek, a Czech countess who served as a lady-in-waiting at the imperial court, and he wanted to marry her. Sophie came from an old Bohemian noble family, sufficiently aristocratic by most European standards, but not by Habsburg standards, which required marriage partners to come from reigning or formerly reigning dynasties. By the rules that governed these things, Sophie was not an acceptable wife for the heir to the Habsburg throne. Franz Ferdinand was prepared to fight for this, in a way that he was not always prepared to fight for things. He spent years pressing the case through intermediaries, making arguments to Franz Joseph that the emperor resisted and then slowly yielded to, not because he was persuaded, but because the alternative was a permanent rupture with the heir he did not particularly want but could not replace. The permission came in 1899, with conditions. The marriage would be morganatic, meaning Sophie would not share her husband's rank, and their children would not be in the line of succession. She would not be permitted to sit beside Franz Ferdinand at official events where protocol governed seating. She would not be received with the honors due an archduchess. The marriage would be real in every human sense, and carefully managed in every official sense to make clear that it was not what it would have been if Franz Ferdinand had married someone the court considered appropriate. He accepted the conditions. He married Sophie in July of 1900, in a ceremony that Franz Joseph did not attend, and that most of the imperial family did not attend. Conducted with the minimum ceremony, consistent with it being a legal marriage. The photographs from those years show something that is easy to miss if you are reading for the political narrative. Franz Ferdinand and Sophie photographed together look like two people who are glad to be with each other. This is not a universal quality in photographs of royal couples from that period. His relationship with Franz Joseph never became warm. They disagreed about the federalism question, about foreign policy, about how to manage the empire's internal tensions, about almost everything except the basic obligation of duty. Franz Joseph was 80 years old when the second decade of the 20th century began. He had been doing it his way for a very long time, and he was not inclined to change his approach because his heir thought differently. The world outside the Hofburg was moving at a speed that neither of them was tracking precisely enough. In Serbia, a kingdom that sat on the southern edge of the empire, the political culture was being shaped by organizations that believed the South Slavic peoples of the Balkans should be unified under Serbian leadership, and that the Habsburg presence in the region was the primary obstacle to that unification. The most active of these organizations operated in the shadow of the official Serbian government, with connections that the Serbian state sometimes acknowledged and sometimes denied, depending on who was asking and what the diplomatic consequences of acknowledgement would be. One of these organizations was called Unification or Death, known by a name that translated as the Black Hand. It had members inside the Serbian military and intelligence apparatus, and by the spring of 1914, it had identified an opportunity. Franz Ferdinand was scheduled to visit Sarajevo on June 28, 1914. Sarajevo was the capital of Bosnia, a province that Austria-Hungary had formally annexed in 1908, a move that had enraged Serbian nationalists who considered Bosnia part of their natural sphere. June 28th was a date with significance in Serbian historical memory. It was the anniversary of the Battle of Kosovo in 1389, the defeat that had ended Serbian medieval independence, and that Serbian nationalist culture had transformed into a founding myth of martyrdom and eventual redemption. The visit had been planned for months. The security arrangements were discussed with the assumption that the precautions being taken were adequate. The assumption was wrong. In Sarajevo, on the morning of June 28th, a group of young men positioned themselves along the route that Franz Ferdinand's motorcade would take from the train station to the city hall. They had been supplied with pistols and grenades by members of the Black Hand network. Most of them were still teenagers or barely past it. The motorcade moved through the streets in the warm morning. The crowds were not hostile. Sarajevo was a complicated city with a complicated relationship to Habsburg rule, and the morning felt manageable to the people in the cars who were reading the crowd. One of the conspirators threw a grenade at the Archduke's car. It bounced off the folded-back convertible roof and exploded under the following vehicle, injuring several people, but leaving Franz Ferdinand and Sophie unharmed. The motorcade accelerated. The conspirators scattered. The morning had failed. Franz Ferdinand continued to City Hall, where he received the mayor's welcoming address with visible irritation. Observing that he had come to Sarajevo and been greeted with bombs, after the ceremony he decided to change the route to visit the people who had been injured in the first attack at the hospital. The change of route was not communicated to all the drivers in the motorcade. The lead car turned onto Franz Joseph Street, the original route, instead of the Appel Quay, where the hospital lay. The error was realized. The car stopped to turn around. Gavrilo Princip was standing in front of a delicatessen on Franz Joseph Street. He was 19 years old. He had been one of the conspirators that morning, had been positioned along the original route, and had done nothing when the motorcade passed, because the situation had not given him a clear opportunity. He had walked away afterward, believing the mission had failed, and had stopped at the delicatessen. The Archduke's car stopped to turn around approximately 1.5 meters from where he was standing. Princip stepped forward and fired twice. The first shot hit Franz Ferdinand in the jugular vein. The second hit Sophie in the abdomen. The car accelerated toward the governor's residence. Franz Ferdinand was heard repeating his wife's name, asking her to stay alive for their children. Sophie died in the car before it arrived. Franz Ferdinand died shortly after arrival. It was approximately 11:15 in the morning. In Vienna, Franz Joseph received the news that afternoon. He was 83 years old. He had been emperor for 66 years. He had buried a brother and a son and a wife, and now a nephew. The particular quality of silence that settled over him when the report was read to him was described by the people present as different from his usual composure, heavier, as if the controlled surface was having more difficulty containing what was underneath it than usual. He said, "No sorrow is spared me." Then he began to consider what came next, because what came next was the question that the assassination had made unavoidable, and the answer was going to determine not just the future of the Habsburg Empire, but the future of a world that did not yet know what kind of future it was about to have. Vienna, July 23rd. 1914. The document had been in preparation for 3 weeks. While the rest of Europe was still absorbing the shock of Sarajevo, while diplomats were sending cautious dispatches and newspaper editors were filling their pages with speculation, the government of Austria-Hungary had been doing something more specific. It had been writing a list of demands so carefully calibrated that the men writing it understood, without stating it plainly, in any document that would survive them, that at least one item on the list had been designed to be refused. The argument inside the Habsburg government in the weeks after Sarajevo was not about whether to respond. It was about what kind of response was possible. The Foreign Minister Leopold von Berchtold and the Chief of the General Staff Franz Conrad von Hötzendorf, who had been arguing for a military confrontation with Serbia for years before Sarajevo gave him the opening he wanted, pushed for a response that would produce a war. The Hungarian Prime Minister István Tisza pushed back, arguing that a war would be dangerous and that the empire should seek a diplomatic resolution that humiliated Serbia without triggering a wider conflict. The argument resolved in the direction of war, partly because Germany sent word making clear it would support Austria-Hungary whatever it decided. Germany wanted a localized conflict in the Balkans that would strengthen its Austrian ally. Germany's calculation about what kind of conflict was likely to result would prove catastrophically wrong within weeks. The ultimatum was delivered to the Serbian government in Belgrade on the evening of July 23, 1914. It contained 10 principal demands. Serbia was required to suppress anti-Habsburg publications and organizations. Serbian officials involved in the conspiracy against Franz Ferdinand were to be removed from their positions. And crucially, Austro-Hungarian officials were to be permitted to participate directly in the Serbian investigation of the assassination, on Serbian soil, under Serbian jurisdiction. That last demand was the one written with particular care. It asked Serbia to allow a foreign government to conduct official functions within its own borders. Sovereign nations did not permit that. The men who wrote the demand understood this. It was not a negotiating position. It was a line drawn precisely where they knew Serbia could not cross it without ceasing to be a sovereign state. Serbia had 48 hours to respond. Those 48 hours moved with a quality that everyone who lived through them later struggled to describe the sense of watching something inevitable unfold that had not felt inevitable even days before. The Serbian government worked through the night, consulting with Russia, which had made clear it considered itself the protector of Serbian interests, and drafting a response that went further toward compliance than anyone in Vienna had expected. Serbia accepted or offered to discuss 9 of the 10 demands. The language was careful and sometimes ambiguous in ways that left room for negotiation. But the overall character of the document was conciliatory to a degree that surprised the diplomats who read it. The British Foreign Secretary, Edward Grey, who read both the ultimatum and the Serbian response in close succession, said that he had never seen a country make so complete a submission in a situation of this kind. The one demand Serbia could not accept was the one designed to be unacceptable. Serbian officials could not be supervised by foreign government representatives on Serbian soil without ceasing in any meaningful sense to be sovereign. Serbia offered instead to submit the matter to international arbitration, to whatever neutral mechanism the powers could agree on. Franz Joseph received the Serbian response at his summer residence in Bad Ischl. His advisers told him it was insufficient. He agreed. Austria-Hungary declared the response unsatisfactory and began mobilizing its military. The declaration of war against Serbia followed on July 28, 1914. What happened next moved with the mechanical logic of a system that had been building for decades and that no individual decision could now stop. Russia began mobilizing in support of Serbia. Russia's mobilization triggered Germany's war plan, which required knocking France out of the war quickly in the west before turning to deal with Russia in the east. Knocking France out quickly required going through Belgium. Going through Belgium brought Britain into the war, because Britain had guaranteed Belgian neutrality in a treaty signed in 1839. In 37 days from the shots in Sarajevo, the major European powers were at war. The war that began in August of 1914 was not the war that anyone had planned for, except in the technical military sense that plans existed for the movements of armies in the first weeks. What no plan had accounted for was what happened when those movements stalled. The trenches appeared in France within weeks. When the German advance stopped and both sides dug in, men lived in the ground. They died in the mud. The weapons that industrial civilization had spent the previous 50 years developing were applied to human bodies at a scale and with an efficiency that the generals had not modeled in their planning, because the planning had been done by people thinking about the last war. Franz Joseph did not understand this war, not because he lacked intelligence, because everything he knew about warfare had been learned in a century that had now ended. In conflicts where armies maneuvered, and one side gained a decisive advantage, and the fighting stopped, and the diplomats went to work. The idea of a war in which both sides simply continued feeding men into a killing machine for 4 years, because neither side could find a way to stop, was not something his experience had given him a framework for. He continued to work. He signed the papers that came to his desk. He wore his uniform and got up at 4 in the morning and did everything the performance of his role required. In the way he had always done everything. He died on November 21st, 1916. He had been emperor for 68 years. He was 86 years old. He died in his bed at Schönbrunn, still in his uniform, with a priest present and with the practical arrangements for the succession already in order. Because Franz Joseph had always kept his practical arrangements in order, his last words, as recorded by his valet, were, "I am behind with my work." The new emperor was 29 years old. His name was Karl. He had known for 2 years that he was going to be emperor. He had not been able to become ready for it in 2 years, because 2 years was not enough time to become ready for what was waiting for him. He was handed the empire on a November evening, while the war it had started was entering its 3rd year and showing no sign of ending. And he understood immediately, with the clarity that sometimes comes when the full weight of a situation lands without warning, that the thing he had been given was not the thing the men before him had held. It was something else now, something that was coming apart. Vienna, November 21st, 1916. The paperwork was already on the desk when Karl arrived. An empire at war generates paper the way a fire generates heat continuously, in all directions, with a momentum that does not pause for transitions of power. The military situation reports, the supply requests, the diplomatic cables, the civil administration correspondence, the hundreds of daily decisions that kept the machinery of a multinational state and its armies functioning. All of it was there. All of it required attention. None of it waited for a new emperor to find his footing before making its demands. Karl sat down at the desk that had been Franz Joseph's desk and looked at what was in front of him. He was 29 years old. He had a wife, Zita of Bourbon-Parma, who was 24 and who had already demonstrated in the 2 years since the war began a steadiness and a clarity of purpose that the people around her noted and relied on. He had children. He had an empire that was losing a war. He was not what Franz Joseph had been. He did not have 68 years of experience managing the gap between what the empire required and what was possible. He did not have the emotional distance that Franz Joseph had built across decades of absorbing loss without letting the absorption show. He felt things in ways that Franz Joseph had trained himself not to feel things, which made him more human and less suited to the specific kind of governance that the Habsburg position had historically required. He also understood something that Franz Joseph, in his last years, had either not understood or had refused to allow himself to understand. The war was not going to end in a Habsburg victory. It was not going to end in any outcome that left the empire intact in the form it currently existed. The war had already consumed resources and lives at a rate that the empire could not sustain, and the longer it continued, the more complete the eventual reckoning would be. He tried to end it. In the spring of 1917, Karl authorized a secret diplomatic approach to the Allied powers through his brother-in-law, Sixtus of Bourbon-Parma, who had French and Belgian connections and could carry messages without going through official channels. Karl was willing to concede territory in exchange for terms that preserved some version of the Habsburg state. The approach failed. The French were interested, but the Italians, who had entered the war on the Allied side with promises of territorial gains at Austria-Hungary's expense, were not interested in a peace that did not deliver those gains. And when the German government learned that its ally had been attempting a secret negotiation, the diplomatic consequences made the situation worse rather than better. Karl was forced to deny publicly what he had done, in terms that later made him look both guilty and dishonest, which was not the image that strengthened a wartime emperor's position. He kept trying. He reorganized the government. He released political prisoners. He attempted to restructure the relationship between the imperial center and the various nationalities in ways that might give the Czechs and the South Slavs and the Poles reasons to remain within a reformed empire rather than agitating for independence. The attempts were real, and they were too late. The two qualities that defined almost everything Karl did in his short reign. The military situation deteriorated through 1917 and into 1918. American entry into the war in April of 1917 added resources and men to the Allied side that the arithmetic of the conflict had not previously included. By the summer of 1918, it was clear to anyone reading the military reports honestly that the war was lost. The nationalities did not wait for the armistice. The Czechs declared independence in October of 1918, with Tomáš Masaryk in Washington and Edvard Beneš in Paris working the diplomatic channels with a skill that the new world of self-determination rewarded. The South Slavs declared their intention to form a new state. The Poles were already organizing their republic. Hungary was moving towards separation. The empire was not defeated from outside in those weeks. It was dissolving from inside. Each nationality detaching itself from the Habsburg structure with a speed that made clear how little the structure had been holding them by the end. Karl signed a document on November 11th, 1918. The same day Germany signed the armistice that ended the fighting on the Western Front. He did not call it an abdication. He called it a withdrawal from participation in the affairs of state. A formulation that preserved, in his own understanding, his status as the legitimate ruler of his peoples, even as those peoples were in the process of organizing themselves into states that did not include him. The distinction mattered to him. It did not matter to the governments that were replacing him. The peace settlements that followed were organized around the principle that Woodrow Wilson had articulated for American entry into the war: the right of peoples to self-determination. The idea that national groups should have the ability to form their own governments rather than living under the authority of multinational empires whose legitimacy rested on dynastic inheritance rather than popular consent. This principle was applied with considerable inconsistency across the map of Central Europe, producing outcomes that satisfied almost no one and that contained within them the tensions that would drive the next generation of conflict. But as a framework for dissolving the Habsburg Empire, it worked with terrible efficiency, because the Habsburg Empire was precisely the kind of entity the principle was designed to dissolve. Austria became a small republic, the German-speaking remnant of what had been the imperial core, so reduced from what it had been that the joke circulated that Vienna was a head without a body, a capital city built to manage a continent, and now managing a country the size of a middling German state. Karl went into exile in Switzerland with Zita and their children. He watched from there as the new states organized themselves, as the men who had served the empire found their places in the new order or failed to find them, as the city of Vienna adjusted to its new dimensions with the mixture of denial and grief that great cities feel when the thing that made them great is suddenly gone. He tried twice to return to Hungary and reclaim the crown of St. Stephen. The first attempt, in March of 1921, ended when Miklos Horthy, who was governing in the name of the monarchy, without intending to restore the monarch, refused to step aside. The second attempt in October of 1921 went further, with Karl actually reaching Budapest by train before Hungarian military forces stopped the advance, and the Allied powers made clear that a Habsburg restoration was not something they would permit. Karl was taken into custody and transferred to British naval custody and transported to Madeira, the Portuguese island in the North Atlantic, selected as a place sufficiently distant from Central Europe to make further restoration attempts logistically impossible. Madeira is a small island. It is green and steep, and the climate is mild. Karl and Zita arrived in November of 1921 with their children and a small household and very little money. Because the new Austrian Republic had not been generous in the financial settlement, and the family's assets in the former imperial territories had been seized or frozen by the successor states, he was 34 years old. He had been emperor for 2 years. He had been in exile for 3. He had 2 failed restoration attempts behind him. He had a family to support on a Portuguese island with the financial resources of a minor aristocrat rather than a ruling dynasty. He got sick in the winter of 1921 and 1922, a respiratory illness that the damp island climate did not help, that the inadequate heating in the house they were renting did not help, that the stress and the exhaustion of the previous 4 years had left him with fewer resources to fight than a man his age should have had. The illness was pneumonia, progressing with the speed that it showed in people whose bodies had been worn down before it found them. Zita did not leave his side. She was 29 years old, and she sat with him through the weeks of his dying in the way that the accounts of those present describe without much variation: steady, present, quiet. The children were brought to say goodbye when it was clear that goodbye was what was required. Karl died on April 1st, 1922, at the Villa Quinta do Monte in Funchal, Madeira. He was 34 years old. His last recorded words were addressed to his son Otto, who was 9, and they were, "I must suffer like this, so my peoples can come together again." He was buried in the Church of Our Lady of Monte in Funchal, in a grave on an island in the Atlantic, the furthest from Vienna that any Habsburg had ever been laid to rest. Zita lived until 1989. She was 96 years old when she died, having outlived her husband by 67 years. Having seen the Second World War and the Cold War and the construction of the European community that her son Otto would spend his career helping to build, she was the last Empress of Austria and the last Queen of Hungary, and she died in a world so different from the one she had been born into that the distance between them was not measurable in years alone. Vienna. The present. The Capuchin Church stands in the first district of Vienna, a few minutes' walk from the Hofburg, from the Spanish riding school, from the museums that hold the paintings and the armor and the crowns and the accumulated objects of 600 years of Habsburg collecting. The church is open to visitors. People walk through it the way people walk through old churches in European cities, with a mixture of curiosity and something quieter underneath. A willingness to be still for a moment in a space that has been holding human weight for a very long time. Beneath it, down a staircase that the signs direct you to follow, is the Kapuziner Gruft. The vault is not large. The ceiling is low. The light comes from fixtures installed with the minimum necessary to make the space navigable. Nothing that would compromise the quality of silence. The place has accumulated over 3.5 centuries of use. The bronze coffins are arranged in rooms that open off a central corridor. The earliest ones plain, and the later ones increasingly elaborate, decorated with the symbols of the territories and the titles and the offices that the person inside had held during their life. More than 100 of them, from the Empress Anna, wife of the Emperor Matthias, buried here in 1619, to the Empress Zita, buried here in 1989. More than 3.5 centuries of a family laid in the same ground beneath the same city. The largest coffin in the vault belongs to Franz Joseph. It is bronze and severe and has the quality of something made to last. Beside it, in the same room, is the coffin of Elizabeth. They are together here in a way that the living versions of them were not always together. In the same room, in the same silence, in a proximity that death arranged and life had difficulty sustaining. The coffin of Rudolf is in a different room. Karl's coffin is in Madeira. This is the detail that stays with you when you think about the end of the Habsburg story. The last emperor of Austria and the last king of Hungary is buried on a Portuguese island, 3,000 kilometers from the vault that holds the rest of his family. In a church, in a city that has long since adjusted to being a destination rather than the capital of a continent, he has been beatified by the Catholic Church, a formal step in the process of considering him for sainthood, which has happened to very few political figures in European history, and which says something about the particular quality of his reign that the Church has found worth examining. The Habsburg family continues. The current head of the house is Karl von Habsburg, born in 1961, the son of Otto, the grandson of Karl and Zita. He has been involved in European politics and in the work of organizations concerned with Central European affairs. He carries the name and the history in the way that people who are born into long stories carry them. Not as a burden, exactly, and not exactly as an asset, but as a context that shapes everything without necessarily determining anything. Otto von Habsburg, in one of the many interviews he gave across his long life, was asked what he thought his family's legacy was. He said that the Habsburg Empire had demonstrated something important, that different peoples could live together under a common political structure without losing what made them distinct. That the alternative to empire was not necessarily the peaceful nation-state that the peace treaties of 1918 had promised, and that the 20th century's experience of nationalism had proven the Habsburg skepticism about nationalism to be more prescient than it had appeared in 1918. He said this without bitterness. He had watched his father die in exile on an Atlantic island. He had grown up, stateless, traveling on documents that identified him as a member of a dynasty rather than a citizen of any country. He had every reason for bitterness, and he appeared to have chosen something else, a long view that placed his family's experience in a frame large enough to find it meaningful rather than merely painful. The frame he chose was Europe. The project of European integration that began in the 1950s, and that produced a union of countries sharing a common market and a set of shared institutions, was, in his reading, the thing that had finally begun to answer the question his family had been asking for 600 years. Not perfectly, not without its own contradictions and failures and ongoing arguments about what it was and what it was for, but genuinely, structurally, in a way that the peace treaties of 1918 had not managed to achieve. The Habsburg answer had been a family. The European answer is an institution. Both were trying to solve the same problem. How do you create a framework large enough to contain the diversity of Central Europe without suppressing that diversity in ways that eventually produce the violence that suppression produces? The Habsburg answer lasted 600 years and ended in a war that killed millions. The European answer is 70 years old and still being tested. Whether that constitutes progress is a question that the vault beneath the Capuchin church does not answer. The vault holds what it holds. Generations of people who lived and ruled and loved and failed and were carried down those stairs and placed in bronze coffins in a room with low ceilings and silence that has been accumulating since 1619. The ceremony happens the same way every time. The door is knocked 3 times. The titles are read. The door refuses them. Twice. And on the 3rd knock, when everything has been stripped away, when the emperor has been reduced to what every person is reduced to in the end, the door opens. A poor sinner asking for mercy. That is how the Habsburgs chose to end every life their family produced. Not with the crowns and the scepters and the accumulated weight of everything they spent 600 years collecting, with the admission that underneath all of it there was a person, the same as anyone else, hoping to be let in. Power is borrowed. Crowns are temporary. The door at the end does not open for emperors. It opens for sinners. It opens for everyone.